and I will introduce our presenter for the day. So the topic today that we're covering, which I'm really excited about, is the new science of addiction and recovery. And our speaker is Dr. John Kelly. So Dr. Kelly is an Elizabeth R. Spallin Professor of Psychiatry and Addiction Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He is the director of the Recovery Research Institute at the Massachusetts General Hospital, MGH, and the associate director of the Center for Addiction Medicine at MGH, and the program director of the Addiction Recovery Management Service. Dr. Kelly is a former president of the American Psychological Association, the APA, Society of Addiction Psychology, and is also a fellow of the APA and a diplomat of the American Board of Professional Psychology. He has served as a consultant to U.S. federal agencies and non-federal institutions, as well as foreign governments and the United Nations. Dr. Kelly has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and books in the field of addiction medicine, and his work has focused on addiction treatment and the recovery process, mechanisms of behavior change, and reducing stigma and discrimination among individuals suffering from addiction. So with that being said, welcome, Dr. Kelly, and I will pass things over to you.
Zora, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. I'm really honored and delighted to be with you. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to present today. I'm really delighted to meet everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm from the UK originally, 32 years ago, but my first stop was in Minnesota. I worked there for just over a year back in 1991. And so in fact, I'm coming out there next week to Minnesota to speak at the March conference. Always love to come back to Minnesota, and I'm very delighted to be joining you today. So let me share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see it. Hopefully, can you see the slides? Okay.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, fantastic, great. Well, thank you. And so, as Zora mentioned, I'm going to be talking today on this topic of the new science of addiction recovery, and hopefully I'll put you in the picture as to why we are where we are now in terms of understanding of addiction and recovery from it. So how do people recover from addiction? And this has become a major emphasis because, of course, we've known for quite a while how to detoxify and stabilize individuals, but then what, right? How do we help people, sustain those gains that are often provided by life-saving treatment, oftentimes provided at the acute care end? Just to begin, I'm going to zoom out over the last 50 years, because in this really gives us, from my view, a kind of a viewpoint to reflect on. Last year actually was a 50-year milestone since the initial declaration of the war on drugs under Nixon. So 50 years has passed. We've learned a lot about addiction, what perhaps to do, what not to do. We've learned a lot about how to best address these problems. We've come a long way, I would argue, but still there's a long way to go, obviously. We're not out of the woods by any means, but we've made progress in certain areas. And I'd like to highlight some of those areas where we have made progress, as well as areas where we're starting to really focus on and hopefully make even more progress. As I mentioned, we've got a long way to go. Here we are, 50 years of investment in addressing these endemic and epidemic problems related to alcohol and other drugs in the United States and around the world. But still, we've got 107,000 opioid poisoning deaths or other poisoning deaths. 2/3 of those are opioid. These just keep on increasing. We have 140,000 alcohol deaths every year. This is not headline news, of course, the way that opioid deaths are, but these are, tragic, unnecessary, preventable deaths. Because the alcohol deaths are the third leading cause of preventable death. So these are unnecessary deaths which occur as a result, partly to do with stigma and discrimination, because we don't address these problems the way that they should be addressed. Now, when we think of the war on drugs, of course, there's a certain rhetoric and a policy stance which is associated with that. The very rhetoric of the war on drugs, of course, implicates and associates this idea of a kind of a militaristic defeat that can be achieved through the hardcore means. Of course, what it meant policy-wise was legislation that was passed being tough on crime, tough on drugs, of course, which led to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which disproportionately affected young men of color, principally locking many young men of color up at a disproportionately high rate. It was an injustice that was done in the name of the war on drugs, with mandatory minimum sentencing, for example. Now, these laws, of course, have shifted and changed. Now we have moved, you zoom out over the last 50 years, we went from those harsh punitive sentencing laws related to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act under Reagan and Bush Senior to the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, the Affordable Care Act, which is public health oriented, clinical oriented legislation to what? To create more access for people. So moving from criminal justice towards public health approaches, and that's been good news. Now, why has that happened? Now, part of the reason why that has happened is because also these institutes were founded. The National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in 1970, 1974, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, or NIDA. Now, those two institutes have produced 90% of the world's knowledge in the last 50 years about what we know about addiction, in terms of all the things that we normally think about regarding the etiology, clinical course, and so on. And this is just depicted here. So when you think about, all the things that we know now about addiction that we did not know 50 years ago, there's a ton that we've learned in the last 50 years. And this has helped, of course, shift this legislation. And now what we see under the new administration is a further shift towards these broader public health and harm reduction approaches that can help people stay alive so that they can get eventually into remission and recovery and have a better life. Now we think about the things that we've learned. We've learned a lot about the etiology, that these disorders are multiply determined, that genetics play a major role. We understand also about the effects in the brain, how we've all seen, I'm sure now, most of us have seen, if not all of us have seen these colorful images of the brain. This is all fairly new. The ability to view inside the brain of living people, to understand the functional changes that go on as a result of drug exposure, as well as the structural changes that go on that can through neurotoxicity. And this has helped us understand, of course, help to decrease stigma and discrimination, because we understand now much more about the genetic influence on addiction, as well as the brain impairment that occurs as a result of these chronic exposure. Also, epidemiologically, we understand much more clearly now about the risk factors in the population, the socioeconomic and other factors that can influence risk for biobehavioral stress, which can increase the risk for substance use and substance use disorder. We've also learned a lot about the pathways. There are multiple pathways into addiction through it, as well as out the other side into recovery, and I'll talk about that. We've also learned a lot about different treatments in the last 50 years. Think about all the things that we have learned in the last 50 years regarding how to best treat and address these endemic problems. As I mentioned, in terms of paradigm shifts over the last 50 years, we've learned a lot about the genetics, and this has reduced this blaming stigma. It's not a moral issue, but rather some people, just by virtue of their DNA, are more susceptible. It's not the whole story. It doesn't mean you're going to get the disorder if you have the genetic predisposition, but you are at 4 to 8 times higher risk of developing the disorder if you have the DNA for it. So we do know that the genes carry about half the risk for addiction, something we didn't know 50 years ago. As I mentioned, in terms of the impact in the brain, look what we've learned about how drug exposure, alcohol and other drug exposure, changes the brain's function quite dramatically and in radical ways. And this is, of course, why we see this impairment in the ability to regulate the impulse to use despite severe and harmful consequences. This is why, of course, it is a psychiatric disorder. If it wasn't, if it was a matter of choice, it would not be in the DSM, as a psychiatric illness. There is an involuntariness to the disorder, which places it in this psychiatric disorder category, where people are trying to stop, but they find themselves, their ability to stop is impaired because of these brain changes. The good news is that the brain recovers also on the other side. When we remove the poison out of the brain, and Mother Nature can then do her work and repair the brain. Now, it doesn't completely return to normal pre-baseline, pre-morbid levels of functioning and structure, but the Mother Nature does an amazing job in terms of helping the brain recover. So you might not be using the interstate to get from A to B, but you can use the side roads to get there pretty quickly inside the brain or in recovery. And people might have some impairment, but they're able to get a lot of their faculty back. Also, from our clinical standpoint, think about the stages of change came up in the 1980s. I think we all, think about now about these stages of change kind of implicitly. This idea of pre-contemplation and contemplation and preparation and action and maintenance as kind of phases of or stages of change through which people pass on their way to recovery from these from addictive disorders. And of course, this has led to different kinds of interventions which can be best suited and matched to different stages of change. Most notably, of course, with pre-contemplation, before people are ready to change or acknowledge they may have a disorder which is causing them problems. Other people may see it and worry about them, but the person themselves doesn't. This, of course, has led the way for things like harm reduction, which has been very important to prevent overdose deaths, as well as transmission of infectious disease. And also the birth of things like motivational interviewing, which helps people to resolve the ambivalence about change. We've also seen many other kinds of interventions as well. I mentioned this is kind of a major paradigm shift in terms of understanding that what people need is not necessarily a good talking to, but a good listening to. And I think this is a very important paradigm shift that happened in the late 80s and early 90s with the birth of motivational interviewing, a humanistic client-centered approach to a very compassionate and empathic one, where the idea is to see the world through that person's eyes, not to argue with them, not to abuse them, try and beat them into submission, which was the old model of psychoanalysis, to try and break through those psychological defenses, but rather to help people to win trust, build empathy, build that rapport through this process of motivational interviewing. Another very important paradigm shift that's occurred in the last 50 years has been the birth of cognitive behavioral therapies, relapse prevention therapies for addiction. These manualized approaches have been able to be disseminated and adopted worldwide, helping people empower clinicians to be able to deliver effective treatment to help people based in sound science in terms of operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Contingency management. The idea that certain swift, modest consequences, positive consequences can shape rewards. This has been now applied clinically, of course, with vouchers and things like that, just for showing up for treatment, that can help incentivize people to stay motivated in treatment. And what we're also trying to do, of course, is the natural contingencies that occur in social environments to empower people to provide that peer support that can provide natural contingencies over time, which can sustain remission over time. We're lucky we've been able to develop new medications, most importantly, of course, Narcan, which is miraculously being able to bring people literally from the edge of death back to life in the context of an opioid poisoning, as well as other medications for alcohol use disorder, as well as opioid use disorder like buprenorphine. Again, has been incredibly helpful in preventing overdose deaths, as well as older drugs like methadone and 3 FDA-approved medications for alcohol: Vivitrol, injectable naltrexone, oral naltrexone, acamprosate, and disulfiram, of course, for alcohol use disorder, have been around for a long time. Now, we still have challenges, as I mentioned. I think some of the big challenges in the field that remain over this last 50 years is that we know only about 10% of individuals who meet criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder are interested in accessing formal treatment. Many of those individuals don't believe they have a problem and they're not interested in getting treatment, but they would respond to maybe some information through the internet, that they could do some self-screening, self-assessment, some behavioral activation at home where they might want to change. So I think we've got a lot of work to do there to try and reach that large number of people who are at the mild and moderate end of the spectrum of substance use disorder, who could definitely benefit from some kind of intervention, but don't get it. Another big thing that we need to address is tackling this disorder earlier in the clinical course. We tend to wait till people have stage 3 or stage 4 addiction before they do anything about it, before we treat it. And so again, we need to do more work in reaching people earlier in the clinical course so we can start to plant seeds earlier and offset a deleterious and maybe fatal course much earlier in the clinical course. The way that we treat other kinds of diseases and disorders. Early screening, early intervention results in better prognosis. Studies show the same is true of substance use disorder. We need to do a better job of making treatments attractive and engaging more earlier and for younger people. Another thing, of course, is to how to prevent mortalities and to help people achieve remission and stable remission sooner from these disorders. And that's what I'm going to talk about today in more detail, in part because one of the other things that we have learned is about the clinical course of these disorders. When we look at the timeline here, depicted here for addiction cases, so these are adults in clinical care settings. So these would be adults with severe substance use disorder, or what we would call addiction to a variety of different substances. And this is what the timeline looks like when we examine the data. So it takes, after people meet criteria for severe substance use disorder, it takes about 4 to 5 years after they meet criteria before they start to seek help. So what that means, partly that's to do with fear of discrimination and the stigma around these disorders. Many people, of course, will try to control it themselves, try to do their best to manage and do their best. But it then comes to the attention of loved ones, of course, first of all, and then it can come to the attention of employers, the police, etc. Now, after people start to seek help, it can take about 8 years and about 4 to 5 treatment episodes before people achieve that first year of full sustained remission. The good news is about 60 to 75% of cases will achieve full sustained remission, but it can take quite a long time to get there. So this is actually a good prognosis disorder. Most people will achieve recovery. I'm not discounting the tragic, premature, unnecessary deaths, because that is a tragedy. But most people who have the disorder will eventually get into remission. But as you can see here, it can take quite a while to get there. It can be a bumpy ride into remission, roughly 4 to 5 treatment episodes on average, mutual help and treatment episode, before people reach that first year milestone of 1 year without symptoms. Here's the other thing. On the right-hand side here, you see that 5-year mark. That's the average number of years it takes after someone achieves full sustained remission, before the risk of meeting criteria for an alcohol or other drug use disorder in the following year drops below 15%. Why 15%? Why is that significant? Because that's the annual risk in the general population of meeting criteria for an alcohol or drug use disorder. So to be no more likely than anybody else in the general population of meeting criteria in the following year for an alcohol or drug use disorder takes 5 years of continuous remission. So what does that suggest? It means that the risk remains elevated for those first 5 years, even after initial remission has been achieved. So people, of course, have to be very careful always, but particularly in this first 5-year period. Now, the obvious question here is, can we speed this up? Is this just an inexorable course of the illness that we have to wait 8 years before somebody gets a year, and we have to wait another 5 years before somebody is able to achieve that stable remission, no greater risk than anybody else in the general population? Now, I think the answer is yes. There are things that we can do to accelerate both the time to initial remission and to stable remission. I often use this metaphor of a burning building to describe the addiction crisis. And I think if we've done one thing right in the last 50 years, we've recognized there is an emergency, the building is on fire, and we need to put the fire out. So what do we need to do? So what have we done? We put the fire out. We've got detoxification, we've got stabilization, we've got acute care treatment, which usually is 12 weeks. 90% of the clinical trials conducted in the last 50 years have been 12-week trials, okay? And I've just showed you this expansive timeline where we need longer recovery support and recovery support services, which I'm getting to. Now, so we've learned how to, very importantly, put the fire out. You've got to put the fire out first. The question is, how do you keep it out? How do you keep it out? And how do you help people with the scaffolding and the building materials that people need, what we call recovery capital? How do you help people to rebuild their life once the fire is out and help fireproof the building? Here's the other thing that's very important, is the building permit. So people need a building permit to start building, right? Same is true in Minnesota, same is true anywhere. You got to get a building permit if you're going to start building something. Now, people are often denied a building permit for their life because of a prior felony conviction related to their drug use. So this is something that really blocks people in recovery of getting hold of the building materials that they need, that can undermine their optimism and hope for the future. Think about that when you're trying to get into recovery, you got a prior conviction. You can't get a job, you can't get a loan, you can't get housing, you can't get the things you need, you can't get the materials you need that will enable you to be able to start rebuilding your life. So this is something that we have to address legislatively also. Now, Biden, of course, the current administration is beginning to make inroads there. That's good news, that we can start to address these convictions, because they're really preventing people from gaining access to the very things that they need, ironically, the very things they need to get their life back on track. The other things that we've learned in terms of recovery management and helping people to, again, can we get people into remission sooner? Can we get to stable remission sooner? Is that there's been greater recognition of these two elements, two aspects that undermine people's attempts to get into recovery. One is these are often called post-acute withdrawal phenomena. And these occur because of the exposure, the chronic exposure from alcohol or other drugs in the central nervous system. And when you take away the drugs, what happens is that there is an aftermath, a post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which is underwritten by these two aspects: an increased sensitivity to stress. People feel more stressed and more sensitive to stress early in recovery, partly neurophysiological, partly because they never learned the coping skills to deal with stress in any other way other than to take alcohol and other drug. Another aspect that undermines recovery is the decreased capacity to experience normal levels of reward. This occurs in the brain. The dopamine system downregulates its receptor system to accommodate these abnormally high levels of reward and reinforcement, which come about as a result of these very potent substances. So the Mother Nature, she just tries to adapt. She's just trying to compensate for these abnormally high levels of a cascade of neurochemicals. So the brain tries to adapt, does its best to try and adapt. So when you take away the drug, there's kind of a period of what's sometimes referred to as hedonic deafness, pleasure deafness. You can't hear normal levels of the pleasure. So a sunny day, a walk in the park, a walk on the beach, a dinner out with friends that used to be fun, a good movie is just blah. It just doesn't cut it the way it used to. Now, of course, that lack of reward sensitivity, which does accrue over time, can really undermine efforts for recovery. So think about that couple. That's a bad combination: hypersensitivity to stress and lower responsivity to normal levels of reward. Now, the good news is that there are things that can be done to help accelerate these changes. We do know that social factors and social supports, for example, living in community residences can help buffer stress and upregulate these downregulated dopamine receptors to accelerate people's capacity to experience normal levels of reward. This is just a model that really depicts this notion of what I'm talking about, of the necessity of having support and the building materials and recovery capital that people need to offset the stress that people feel early in recovery. And you can see here that under normal circumstances, when this is taken from Hans Seeley's work on allostatic load and general adaptation syndrome. But what you can see here is that early in recovery, there's an alarm situation typically which stimulates the cessation attempt. And for a while, people can resist. They can resist the temptation. They can hold on for a while, but they become exhausted. What happens is exhaust without the right environment, without the right support, the human organism will desist in persisting. And so this is where we need the access to these building materials, the scaffolding, the building permits that can help people resist this temptation so that we can see this continue to go up over time. And this is what we've seen. I'll show you that in a minute. So we can think about recovery as a kind of a biaxial phenomenon where we have remission on one axis and we have the positive consequences of remission or recovery capital on the other axis. But these are biciprocal. So as people are able to maintain their remission longer, they start to accrue recovery capital. But also it works the other way. So the more recovery capital that we can provide, it also helps to increase the chances of ongoing remission. How does it do that? Because it reduces the stress, the allostatic load in people's lives when we provide these building permits, the building materials, the scaffolding that people need. And we can help mitigate this allostatic load and increase the chances of ongoing remission. I liken this to kind of photosynthesis. If you create the right conditions, something will grow in the plant world. If we create the right environments for plants, plants can not just survive, but plants will actually thrive and produce flowers and flourish. I think about that tendency of the right environment to produce flourishing plant organisms, very similar to the way that recovery works. I liken recovery to a kind of psychosynthesis instead of a photosynthesis, a kind of a psychosynthesis, whereby if we can create the right kind of environment for the human organism can recover and thrive and flourish. And I think these dimensions noted here, the social environment, the activities, there can be physical activity as well as jobs, education, nutrition, and emotion regulation. Together, these four pillars can help this kind of notion of the human version of photosynthesis or psychosynthesis of addiction recovery can facilitate that for human beings. And this makes this nice acronym a saner approach to recovery. The social, the activity, the nutrition, and the emotion regulation components. The social you can think of as the soil. The social environments are the kind of the soil through which the other nutrients of recovery are absorbed and exchanged by lived experience oftentimes, as well as, of course, through providers and clinicians. Now, this has all led, of course, to the growth, the birth and growth, and now greater evaluation of a number of different recovery support services, which are intended to provide that social structure, which is so key to this environmental support. And we've seen now this big change. This idea has been around for a long time, but now it's been amplified and extended around the country and supported now by the federal government in providing money for evaluation of these kinds of services, as well as provision of them to help support individuals after that initial stabilization period. We know, again, we've got good treatments that can detoxify, that can stabilize. We've got good medications for some disorders. But what do we do then? What do we do after the 12 weeks of the manualized psychotherapy that has been tested? What do we do in the remaining months and years of early recovery? So a lot of these entities have emerged and grown. Recovery coaching, mutual help organizations, recovery residences, physical and recreational activity organizations like Phoenix, recovery community centers or recovery cafes, as well as recovery programming in educational settings like collegiate recovery, recovery high schools, and employee assistance programs, as well as other recovery-ready workplaces. These are all critically important in the recovery ecosystem, of course, to create a recovery-oriented system, to connect the dots between our acute, expensive clinical care services and what people need to sustain those changes in the communities in which people live. This is what's very important when we talk about recovery management or disease management, is that people need that support to be accessible, flexible, available, and low cost. And so all of these resources have emerged and grown and now are starting to be evaluated. The last thing I want to mention before we open up for questions is recovery milestones, what we're learning in recovery science about recovery milestones. Now, why is this important? This is important because we want to know who needs what, when, for how long, for what duration, at what intensity, right? Who needs what service, for how long, at what intensity. So this is why it's important to be able to identify when in the dynamic course of recovery, people need what kind of service and who needs what, because not everybody needs the same service. There are different people who need different things. So this is what we're trying to do. And you can see here some initial milestones, which are delineated here on the left. Initial recovery is that first 3-month period, early recovery, the 4 to 12-month period, sustained recovery, the first 1 to 5 years, and then stable recovery, 5 or more years. Again, these are just preliminary stages which have been documented based on the remission criteria. Now we do know, and we're starting to learn about the dynamic course of recovery. What I'm showing you here are data on this graph from our National Recovery Study. This was a study that was conducted a few years back by our institute. And for the first time, we estimated national recovery prevalence. This was on a nationally representative sample of the US adult population, where we estimated that 23 million people were living in recovery in the United States. That's 9.1% of the adult population. So we're surrounded by tens of millions of Americans who are in recovery, living in recovery. But we don't know it oftentimes because people don't disclose it. Obviously, for fear of discrimination and other kinds of ramifications, which they fear may happen if they did disclose it. So, of course, there's lots to work on there. Now, what I'm showing you here is the trajectory over 40 years of recovery. So if you look on the bottom of this graph here, you see that there were people in recovery in this study who were just a few weeks in recovery up to 40 years in recovery. You see that across the bottom? And then up the vertical axis are these different indices of functioning and well-being. So this is really documenting what happens to people when they get in recovery regarding things like quality of life and functioning, happiness, recovery capital, which is kind of a measure of all those things, those building materials I mentioned, self-esteem, how people feel about themselves, and psychological distress, which we hope, of course, will go down. And in fact, when you look, we zoom out here, the 40-year temporal horizon, you can see here very nicely that the sweeping down here of psychological distress and the sweeping up of all these positive indices that go up year on year, every year that somebody remains in recovery, we see this implication here that people are getting better and feeling better, functioning better year on year. What you also see is the steeper incline in that first 5 years. You see that? This is where, in fact, the curves change significantly in this slope, is right around that 5-year mark. Interesting, that mirrors what I said earlier in terms of that 5-year marker where people are no greater risk than the general population. It's reflected here. There's something about that first 5 years where people are really climbing up that hill. They're trying to feel better, they're trying to do better, they're trying to get back on track, and particularly in that first 5 years. And after that, it changes significantly, still going up in a positive way, but shifting in terms of the rapidity of the increase. Now, in terms of who needs what, we do know that everybody is not the same, right? So there are different ways to think about how the needs of different people. One is primary substance. So here's a graph showing in the first few years of recovery, quality of life and recovery capital. And you can see here it's passed out by different primary substance. So when we look at, on the right-hand side, for example, with recovery capital, we have different primary substances, cannabis, alcohol, opioids, and other drugs, which is principally stimulants, cocaine, crack cocaine, and methamphetamine. Now look in the first 2 to 3 years, you see people with primary opioid and stimulant use disorder have a distinct disadvantage. Now, these guys up here are not good either, but relative to the alcohol and cannabis groups, people with primary opioid and stimulant use disorders start off at a distinct disadvantage in terms of recovery capital and quality of life. It takes 2 to 3 years longer for them to catch up to their counterparts who have a primary alcohol or cannabis use disorder. On average, again, it's just on averages. But this also, of course, indicates what we know to be true, which is people with opioid, particularly injection heroin use and stimulant users, tend to be more stigmatized, more marginalized. They have a harder time gaining acceptance in society with their histories. We know this to be true in many different facets. They themselves feel more stigmatized. They've internalized a lot of that stigma themselves. And so what does this do? It tells us who needs more of what, right? What do we need to do to try and help these folks down here get back up here on par at least? And everybody needs to be up, but how to at least address this disparity, this increased marginalization, stigmatization, to get these folks more help who need it. I'm pleased to say that recovery community centers that we're doing studies on right now really are helping with this, particularly with the opioids folks, in terms of helping them find support earlier and improving their quality of life more quickly. When we look at racial ethnic groups, here's another dimension to look at. Who in particular, again, is likely to need what kind of service? Now, what we find here is similarity across most racial ethnic groups in recovery, except the Native American, Alaska Native group. You can see here the quality of life is very shaky for this group. Even over the first 5 years starts to diminish. Psychological distress actually increasing, happiness decreasing for the Native American, Alaska Native. So again, it's helping to identify who needs what. So we know that group is at greater risk than other groups in terms of the kinds of functioning quality of life. There's something missing for that group that needs attention. So this is how recovery science is pointing out who needs what and where. Sexual minorities, LGBTQ compared to the heterosexual majority, the sexual minorities versus heterosexual majority. Look at the disparities here. This is over 40-year horizons. Quality of life disparity, psychological distress, they have more. Happiness is lower. Self-esteem, look at that. Look at the magnitude of the difference here in terms of self-esteem. How people in sexual minority status groups, gay, lesbian, bisexual in this case, are having a hard time feeling good about themselves regardless of how long they've been in recovery. So again, what is this doing? It's like helping us identify which particular subgroups of individuals may need greater attention. Also dynamically in the course of recovery. In other words, who needs what, when do they need it? So we're starting to look at this dynamic trajectory. Here we're zooming in on the first couple of years of recovery. What's really interesting here, you see on the right-hand side, is that here's the first 2 years of recovery here. Now we're zooming in under putting the first couple of years under the microscope. Same indices of functioning. So we have quality of life, happiness, recovery capital, self-esteem, etc. But look what happens in the second half of the first year here. People are stabilized. There's kind of a convalescent period here, followed by a big drop, significant drop in quality of life and functioning and self-esteem in the second half of the first year. So why isn't this just going steadily up when we put this under the microscope? Well, what may be happening, I'm theorizing here, I'm hypothesizing here. What may be happening is that if you take that burning building metaphor again, is what's happening is the fire is out and people are pretty happy here. But then as the smoke clears out of the building, they're starting to appraise the damage here in the second half of the first year. So the smoke starts to clear and they look around and say, oh my God, look what I've got to clear up. They look forwards and say, look what I've got to make up. And those two thoughts, as the smoke starts to clear out of the building, the fog starts to clear out of their head, they start to appraise the damage and look at all the things they've got to make up for and catch up and clear up. And that may lead to this disillusionment, a kind of a paradoxical distress in the second half of the first year, where people may lose hope. And I think this is where we need to really build the bridge here and instill hope in terms of providing the access to the building materials, providing that building permit so that people can have that hope that things are going to get better, that they can rebuild their life, that they can get the permit they need to start rebuilding. This is really depicted here in this recovery curve that I put together a little while ago, which really highlights these different stages potentially of recovery across time. You can see across the bottom of the graph here, we have initial, early, sustained, and stable recovery. And up here, we have quality of life and well-being. And so what I've done here is just really delineated this, what we're learning about this, the dynamics of recovery, where we have this initial convalescent period where people are stabilized. This could be in a residential or an outpatient setting, detox setting. And this can be followed, it looks like, by a kind of paradoxical distress that comes on people through this dawning of reality. As the smoke clears, the brain clears, the pink cloud, sometimes called pink cloud, wears off. And there's a reality check where people say, man, this is looking tough. I've got a lot to clear up here. I've got a lot to make up. That can lead to this paradoxical distress. Now, this can be gotten through, of course, what I call here the industrial resolution. In other words, the resolve to get busy. Now, people will have a resolve to get busy if they believe that getting busy will have an effect. Now, if they're denied a building permit, if they don't have access to the building materials, they're not going to get busy because they've got nothing to work with. So this is where these things become so important. I think in the second half of that first year, where the dawning of reality happens, there's a paradoxical distress. If we can supply hope through these materials, people can start looking towards the future. They'll say, yep, I can do this. I can see my peers doing this. They've already gotten over this hump. I can do it. I need access to these materials. And then there's a period of reconstruction, of course. And this can be continued by a period of conservation and growth. And this is what we see when we look over time. So with that, I'll stop there, Zora, and hopefully we can have a chat and answer some questions and have some discussion. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I know I went through that pretty quickly, so we can unravel more of that in the time we got left, I hope. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. That was great. I know I learned a lot of new information, and I think all of us can just start thinking about how do we apply this to the work that we're doing. So we do have some time to take a few questions. You guys can feel free to unmute and ask those directly. I see already that Barry, you have your hand up, so you can start us off.
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Kelly. Let me put myself on screen here. Okay. I have been working on this whole thing with beyond 2 years of sobriety for several years now, and I think I even did a workshop here about it. What you have just described is what I've been looking for the research side of it. One thing I've noticed over the years is that we don't often have a lot of information about long-term recovery. And what you're showing here is what many of us have intuitively felt. It's I'm going wow the whole time through this, because so what is it that we can do best or better in early recovery, those of us who work in early recovery, to plant the seeds of long-term recovery instead of just focusing only on the acute? And maybe we have to focus only on the acute up through 6 months, that first half of that first year. And after that is when that building of true long-term recovery happens. How do we do that?
Well, that's a great question, Barry. Good to meet you. Thanks for the question. And thanks for your work in the field. I pondered that. What would be the kinds of things that we could do in the second half of that first year, vis-a-vis, helping people stabilize again, where they feel, that sense of potential disillusionment, where they start to realize what they got to do, and that is daunting. And I think at that point, peers can be very powerful, where they can see other people living role models, observable evidence in front of them. This is where I think these social recovery support structures have become so important and have been, of course, for a long time, but are increasingly so. Not for everybody, but for many people, they need to see real evidence and to be encouraged and supported and cheerleaded through that period, that they can get through this hump. They can get over this hump. Now, of course, the things that we have to do at the policy level, I believe also with prior felony convictions, to enable people to be able to get past that so that they're not blocked from the very building materials that they need to access to be able to rebuild their life. So I think policy levels, I think at the very human on the ground level, in terms of peer support structures, other structures that provide access. I think a good example are recovery community centers, which have grown and are expanding all over the country. We have about 27 now. We're still going to have 40 here in little old Massachusetts, which is a little state, but we're going to have these bricks and mortar access points which provide access to these building materials. They provide linkages to jobs, to employers who will take people currently with a criminal record, will provide job training. They can provide, how to put together a cover letter and a CV, how to get back into education, how to get legal services, family services. All of these things are accessible through these hubs in a very rich, supported milieu, populated by peers in recovery. So I think these things are good models of what can be achieved to help provide what, in many ways, what people need at different points. And of course, they provide access points for people to give back also, because a lot of people in recovery want to give back. And so they want to help other people, give them a helping hand. And this provides a nice venue for them to do that and bolster their own recovery as well, and long-term recovery. Thanks for the question. Yeah, other questions?
Josephine, you work at Wayside, so I know you got my Josie.
That's fine. Yeah, so I just want to really thank you, Dr. Kelly, for that, because I'm at my 6 years in sobriety, and I did at that point, at my 5 years, I did hit that point to where I did see my recovery start to decline versus to upclimb because of all the other changes in the world that happened with COVID-19, loss of work people in the workplace, and the loss of sobriety and NA and AA meetings. So now that I got a bigger and better understanding of that, I have a better idea of how I can help my clients moving forward. I work with clients also outside of Wayside, and I always tell them, wherever you go, and if you just save my number and something were to happen, please call me, because I would gladly take you and reintroduce you to whatever point you need to go to, whether it need to be looking for a new job, whether it be looking for housing support, whether it be hey, I need to go back to treatment. Let me help you find out what is best suited for you and to go from there. So I really, really appreciated this today. It's something I really needed to hear. And I just wanted to say thank you and let you know that it was very informational.
Right. Thanks, Josephine. I appreciate your feedback. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Josie. Carolyn Palmer.
Hi there. Thanks so much for this presentation today. My name is Caroline Palmer. I work at the Minnesota Department of Health and work in the area of human trafficking prevention. And we're working on a project right now looking at the connections between exploitation, trafficking, and substance use. And I just was thinking in the sort of trajectories that you've presented to us, what influence or impact does really acute trauma, like being a victim of a crime, such as trafficking or exploitation, how does that play into the sort of analysis that you have over months and years of recovery?
Yeah, well, we don't have that measured in that study, in that particular database, but we do know from other studies that trauma, of course, experience of trauma is a risk factor itself for addiction. And of course, having an addiction increases the risk of having a trauma as well. So it works both ways. But nevertheless, it's strongly correlated either way you look at it with substance use. And severe trauma can be really undermine people's recovery. So it's a risk factor, of course, and it has to be. It's one of those factors. I bet if we looked at people with trauma histories, again, if we looked at those graphs and did the same thing, we might find similar challenges that we find among other groups. I would hypothesize that for people with trauma histories, it might be more difficult for those individuals compared to those without trauma histories to make those gains as quickly in terms of quality of life, functioning, self-esteem, because of those trauma histories. So again, it's another variable in the mix that we're going to need to look at, a very important one, of course. And also, we need to look at the intersection, what we call now intersectionality, or the intersection between, in other words, having multiple risk factors at once. So being LGBTQ and having a trauma history and being a Native American and being, if you imagine that density of risk, what those groups look like who have those multiple kinds of challenges, and what we need to do to help them. So these are early days in recovery science, but we're starting to uncover and discover now many of these elements, which we hope to be able to address more squarely going forwards in the next. And my guess is over the next 20 years, we're going to learn a lot about recovery, because there's been a greater emphasis on looking at how do we help people after this acute care stabilization. What do people need in this first year, in the first 5 years? Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we can take maybe one more question. Did anybody have any lingering questions that they'd like to ask before we start wrapping things up?
Well, I've got one. Again, I didn't know how to figure out the hand raise. I don't see it on.
No worries.
But I know, like, one thing that helped me in particular, so I have bipolar 1 or 2 or something like that. And when I studied peer resource specialist work, I was surprised at first, like, oh, it's recovery from either, substance use or mental health. But when I realized it's all the same, that was helpful. So I think if there's some way every person could be on the same, quadrant of, like, we're all in the same boat, so to speak. Like there was one Wayside recovery session where it was a quadrant where you were either, had mental illness, good recovery, good mental health, and things like that. So I'm thinking if there's something like that for the general public it's not like those people over there, you know what I mean? I don't know if that would be a PSA or something like that, but something that gets away from the us and them, like from the Rudyard Kipling poem, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, Christine, is it Christine?
yes.
Yeah, Christine, nice to meet you. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly.
Yeah. I love your comment. I think there's so much to do, isn't there, in terms of educating the public around these issues in an attempt to help destigmatize these disorders across the whole spectrum, the mental health spectrum, including substance use disorder and other kinds of psychiatric disorders, as you mentioned. There's so much education and disabusing of information and faulty beliefs that people have, that we definitely got our work cut out, in terms of doing that. But I think, many people here, and maybe yourself, will be an ambassador of that communication to educate the public, so we can help to destigmatize these disorders and gain greater, decrease discrimination and gain greater acceptance and support for people who have them, suffer from them, and suffer greatly, as well as their families. So there's so much that we all need to do there. We try and do that through, we publish a monthly bulletin, which is freely available. You can sign up for it, by the way, if you want to get it yourself, at recoveryanswers.org. What we do there is we translate the research for the benefit of the public good, policymakers, clinicians, as well as people, families, and people in or seeking recovery, to provide, information to make use of the science, in other words, to hopefully benefit people and empower people with data, with real data, because a little bit of data can go a long way. And when we do studies which can help with stigma and discrimination, and by the way, I didn't show it today, but people in recovery really support communities. They are major assets in communities. They are tax-paying individuals, hardworking. They kind of turn that compulsivity into positive compulsivity. So instead of self-destruction, it's construction. So it's a lot of good things that happen by people in recovery. And people need to know that too, all the good things that people do. So we're, again, we're documenting that. We need to get that out, and we're trying to do that. But I'd love to hear from you and others if you have ideas about how we can better do that, because that's our task, is to kind of get that information out. Thanks for the question, Christine.
Thank you so much. Just again, thank you, Dr. Kelly. Amazing presentation, lots of great information. Thank you all for the questions and great discussion. I'm going to stop.